The FSIN audit was among many of our topics for this week's Truth in Politics panel. With us, as always, is Jennifer Laewetz, CEO of Paskwâw Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair, columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Jennifer, Niigaan, great to see you both. Jennifer, let's start with the latest twist in the ongoing saga to reform the child welfare system. AFN Regional Chief Joanna Bernard has resigned from her role as portfolio holder for children and families. Bernard putting the blame on the National Children's Chiefs Commission. Her resignation comes as Canada is in court basically trying to take these negotiations back to step one. Well, what are your thoughts on this latest development?
Well, I think it's a little bit unfortunate because we don't need these hurdles while we're trying to advance things like child welfare. I'm not surprised to hear that it is difficult to work with, chiefs across the country, especially in the manner of trying to work together. We already saw at AFN last year during the vote that this was going to be a very contentious issue and it was going to be very difficult to get over that goalpost. I think it's important right now more than ever that the chiefs go back to their communities and kind of make those decisions. I don't know if we need to start doing surveys, more data collection, whatever it is we need to do to try to get that consensus, and then we bring it nationally, because right now it just seems by putting all of these, really strong and very, very overly opinionated leaders into a room and on any types of committees, it's not seeming to go anywhere. We do know that we can't give up and we can't, be showing publicly that there's all of these fractures in this work. We don't need Canada to know that we can't get along, especially on an issue so important. So not surprised to hear this, but it is disappointing.
Yeah, Niigaan, the children and families portfolio at the AFN is pretty important one right now as efforts to get a better deal than the earlier $47.8 billion proposal. In a statement to APTN News, the National Chief said the portfolio would be filled later this fall. What do you think that means for negotiations?
Well, it tells you two things. One is that they aren't going well internally at the AFN. And also, let's not forget that the federal government, almost everybody who's worked on this agreement is gone now. And at the federal government level, there is the big scandal, or if you can call it a scandal, with Gary and Desingari at the federal government level. Mark Miller is way off in the wilderness now. All of those major factors, those individuals who are really at the key of engaging this child welfare issue, those are mostly all gone. And so it's almost like we're beginning this negotiations anew. And maybe on one level this is good, but it certainly doesn't provide speed for those victims and the survivors of what has been a long span of mistreatment by the federal government that has driven First Nations kids into the child welfare system. And it also is very disheartening, I think, for so much progress had been done to have the deal rejected, and then the federal government to just sort of ignore it, not come back to the table, and then also the chiefs to not quite figure out their approach. Certainly, I think in the end will turn out to be, as it is now, a regional negotiation.
Wanted, of course, to talk this week about next week's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Jennifer, how important is September 30th?
I think it's incredibly important. I know last year it really highlighted why it was important when posting a photo wearing an orange shirt turned into a unleashed racist fest on social media, because it seems like there are still a lot of people that are not really understanding what the concept of truth and reconciliation actually is. And, we're still seeing headlines of, ongoing residential school denialism. And there just seems to be so much that we still have to undo. But unfortunately, it's only going to get there when the non-Indigenous people start recognizing what it means to be a good ally, what it means to actually talk about these things and to allow space for the truth to be out there. And, we're only a few years in and we've already seen, Justin Trudeau that was surfing on the first Truth and Reconciliation Day. So then the conversation got diverted very, very quickly about what the purpose of it was. And, we're still seeing, residential school denialists being invited onto universities. And we shouldn't have to over policy ourselves to not have this happen. It should be basic human decency that we're still recognizing what is right, what is wrong, and what we need to do to move forward on the concept of reconciliation. So I'm hoping that it's a day where people take the time to listen and take the time to learn. It's a really great day to get out and engage in local activities and events that are going on, especially if it might be your first time and you're not sure where to start. I think it's a really good day to have that inclusive space for everyone to participate.
Niigaan, this is also the 10th anniversary of the release of the final report by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How are you feeling about Truth and Reconciliation as we approach Orange Shirt Day?
Well, it's hard not, of course, to divorce and separate the movement of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the decade since the release of the final report, the 94 calls to action, of course, with the soon-to-be anniversary of my father's passing. It's certainly a time in which there's a lot of memories and a lot of really wonderful recollections of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But in many ways, I just came this morning from a small school, and there was 500 kids in a gym, and they're all wearing orange shirts. And we have opened up with the young men's drum group, all of whom are under the age of 15, singing songs in the language. And then there was a residential school survivor after I spoke who talked about some pretty harsh things in front of that very hushed, very dedicated crowd. So I think we can get caught up a lot in kind of feeling like reconciliation isn't moving fast. This is the 5th day of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. For all the reasons Jen spoke about, absolutely, I think there's a lot of reasons to feel pessimistic and sometimes feel that there's things aren't moving fast enough. And then you see the young people, and the young people are ready for this. They are wearing orange shirts. They're joining together, Canadians, Indigenous peoples, newcomers, and they're walking together. And they're the most competent generation in history. So I think there's lots of reason to have some hope. And I also think that since the TRC has been implemented, it's the most successful commission in history with the most amount of implementation, far more so than some of the other commissions that have happened over the years. And I think that while only about 10 or so of the calls have been implemented fully, there is progress and there is steps being made, and I hope that that continues in the future. This is not the time to slow down.
Of course, we'll have special coverage all day on Tuesday as well. We're going to leave it there, but we're going to be discussing the FSIN audit and vandalism at the offices of Manitoba cabinet ministers over on the Truth and Politics podcast. Thanks to you both. Jennifer, the federal audit into the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations is finally public. The numbers are what had been reported. Anything stick out to you from the audit?
I think what stuck out for me the most was how evident it is that, ISC is essentially in these things for themselves. And I mean that respectfully. But at the same time, we're starting to see what forensic audits actually look like from a federal government. And I think a lot of people are not understanding that, forensic audits from the federal government is them essentially auditing how that funding was received by that organization and some of the recommendations that come from it. So they audit things like program spending and that sort of thing. They're not going to go, down into the weeds and start releasing names or anything like that. So it comes back to us as a people on what type of accountability parameters are we actually putting onto our leadership. I don't care how soft or how hard anyone thinks that this audit was when it was communicated. What actually concerns me is the fact that the FSIN leadership has not been communicating with anybody. Where are you? What is going on? What is happening here? Do you not have a crisis communications team that could at least give you a hint that you should be talking not only with your chiefs that you represent, over 70 of them, but with everyone else that is still not hearing from the FSIN? I cannot believe that they read this report on September 11th. Today is the 24th or 25th of September. We still have not heard from them. And this is supposed to be the political body that represents First Nations in Saskatchewan. And right now we're seeing a political body that does not have the backbone to communicate on what the heck is going on internally there and why we're hearing about, tens of millions of dollars being questioned.
We are expecting to hear from some First Nations leadership tomorrow on Friday, not the FSIN that I am aware of, but Niigaan, over $34 million in questionable, ineligible, or unsupported spending. We'll hear more, I guess, tomorrow, but what do you think happens next here?
Yeah, we went through some of the nuts and bolts last week on the podcast here. You start losing a sense of the intricacies of what Jen's talking about when they talk to me these big figures of money and kind of the unaccountability. Now, there's two ways to look at it. The first is that First Nations organizations are chronically under-resourced, underfunded, under-supported. Human resources are often at a minimum. Nobody on a First Nation grows up to dream to be an accountant. And so when we do get accountants, A, they're very rare, and B, they're not often our people. We often have to work with people outside of our communities who are interested far more in profit than community development. And so we're struggling all the time trying to, just administrate and deal with this massive bureaucracy of the federal government. On another level, it's exactly what Jen spoke about. As a member of the media, I'm constantly frustrated with the fact that, frankly, Indigenous organizations, especially groups that are formed from chief lobby efforts, which are not really governments often, they act as they want to be treated like governments when they want to be treated like governments, but then when they want to be held accountable like governments and they suddenly are not governments anymore, they certainly don't act that way. They ban media from meetings. They have closed door. They target people particularly, and one of, Jen certainly knows that personally. This is not the way governments are supposed to act. We're supposed to be for the people, by the people, all those kinds of things. And oftentimes, I think First Nations organizations are able to put up a shield to say, I'm government on a Thursday, but I'm not government on a Friday. And I think that is a real sad, tragic part of this whole story, which is that our leadership doesn't often feel that they can have to be accountable to people like media or, frankly, even some of their own citizens. And that's very frustrating because many of us are out there saying always, recognize First Nation sovereignty, recognize that we have the ability to speak for ourselves, and then work very hard within communities to do that. And then certain individuals in certain positions of power then act differently.
Well, moving on to another disturbing thing that's been happening lately in this Truth in Politics panel that's pretty stacked here and wide-ranging. Jennifer, 2 cabinet ministers in Manitoba have had their constituency offices vandalized. Bernadette Smith's has been hit by fires 4 times. Nahanni Fontaine's constituency office, the windows were smashed out last weekend. Police aren't saying a whole lot here. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, to put it bluntly, political violence or political intimidation and breaking the law and vandalizing property is a hard stop for me. I do not agree with it in any capacity, and I do not think there are any excuses out there that make this type of behavior okay. I just don't think it's necessary. I've had my own frustrations with Minister Fontaine, obviously when she was blocking the media and, the disrespect to the disability community in Manitoba as an Indigenous person with a disability was really hard to stomach for obvious reasons. But at the same time, what do we do when we're frustrated? We can take our words, online. We can take our words to letter writing campaigns. We've even seen through Idle No More that there are ways to peacefully demonstrate and to have a message moved, even across the country, nationwide, when we need to. But I do not think we need to resort to that, nor do I think that that's going to get the outcome you think it's going to have. I do think that, the police do need to start taking, these political threats and intimidation a little bit more seriously, because we are seeing it across the country, and we're seeing it across political parties, and we're even seeing it down in the United States with, the Trump administration and the more silencing of media and that sort of thing. And I think as we start to see more and more of that, you're going to see people getting more and more frustrated. And so I think there's a responsibility on the government side to remember that they are accountable to the people and they need to be able to be open and willing to take criticism and questions. But then on the other side, there's that civilian duty of do not break the law and stop trying to smash windows to make a point, because that's when everybody stops listening.
Niigaan, both of these cabinet ministers happen to be First Nations women. At an unrelated press conference this morning, Premier Wab Kinew was asked about this, condemned it, of course, but there hasn't been a lot. Should leadership be speaking out about this?
Yeah, of course. And my one little part that maybe people don't know about is that the NDP has been in retreat for days. And so simply they've been internal policy development. It doesn't excuse anything, of course, for not speaking out on this issue or making a public statement. And then it's also important to realize that, of course, absolutely, that Minister Fontaine, Minister Smith, are being targeted in lots of ways. There are also others that have been targeted, and Winnipeg seems to be a site of some major anti-Indigenous government issues. Minister Vandal for the federal government was certainly, his constituent's office was also vandalized just in the lead up to the last election. my point is that there is a burgeoning issue, and it's increasingly being racialized, and it's increasingly being targeted towards individuals who are standing up, putting their name out for government, and then being in the midst of some very hard kind of moments within the community. Maybe, yes, making a mistake. I think the real parts of the story that's kind of something that people want to keep an eye out for is there is this kind of growing schism, or kind of maybe a gap, or certainly between the ways in which Premier Canoe and some of his members of his cabinet are there's some silence, there's some relationships that perhaps might be leading to some problems publicly. But on the other hand, I think that if there's anything Premier Canoe's hasn't come out as vociferously, but he has constantly always said that we need to get beyond political violence. We need to be able to discuss things openly. And he has said consistently on the moose issue, for example, a hunting issue in Manitoba, is we have to get beyond just clickbait and anger and quick reactions. And we have to get together. We have to sit together at a table, and we have to do that respectfully and meaningfully. And maybe this plays into that, but I also think that there's some relationships between the Manitoba NDP and the public that's beginning to fray a little bit. And I think that some of the stuff that Jen spoke about just a minute ago, I also think the issue of poverty and Minister Smith and some of the frustration that's happening within the downtown core of Winnipeg. Poverty is getting worse, homelessness is getting worse. And I think that there is kind of a relationship between the NDP and the public that is maybe becoming a bit frustrating. Maybe there's a gap there.
Niigaan, you managed to squeeze in the moose issue just a little there anyways, as you were hoping to do in this already.
That's what I suggested we speak about, but there's so many topics this week.
Yeah, busy week indeed. Always a great conversation. Great to see you both. Thanks.
You watch. Thanks.
Thanks.